That's a lot of strength. You're putting in a lot of effort.
If you had strong feelings about that scene, whatever they may be, you're in the right place. Today, we're diving into why Love in Deepspace has skyrocketed in popularity. Since its global release in January of 2024, the game has amassed over 14 million downloads and generated nearly $400 million in revenue, making it one of the top-grossing otome games to date. This particular scene, featuring Silas in a vulnerable, intimate moment, a shower scene, exemplifies the game's appeal to its core audience. For many women, such scenes and moments like this offer a blend of emotional connection and fantasy fulfillment. However, it's also scenes like this that have led to some critical takes, with some critics even labeling the game as overly fan-servicey, and even dismissing it as catering solely to just sexual fantasies. My honest interpretation of why men might not like this game is that it perhaps strikes them as unrealistic, overly emotional, and something they might collectively label as cringe.
You're here.
One hilariously notable example of this reaction is the recently introduced period tracker, which monitors the player's cycle in Love in Deepspace. Some online discussions have described this feature as weird, predatory, or even just downright wrong. However, I believe that this perspective overlooks the fact that many women simply just appreciate it when someone remembers and acknowledges their cycle in a caring manner.
How many packs do you need this time?
Dismissing the period tracker as outright predatory seems more reflective of a deeper discomfort some men have. Additionally, the period tracker may also contribute to a perception that the game distorts reality.
Even when you're not on your period, you should always be mindful of how much pressure you apply to your abdomen.
For some men, this feature can signal perhaps a potential disconnect from real-world relationships and interactions. The idea that a game like this would simulate such an intimate aspect of life could be potentially unsettling, making men question whether players are becoming too immersed in a digital fantasy. While this assumption isn't necessarily correct or fair on the men's side, it does reveal an underlying tension point between escapism and perceived social detachment. It kind of shows a tinge of insecurity that I'd like to touch on later on in this video. Before we get into the meat of my thoughts though, let's talk about otome games. In my view, enjoying something, so long as it's not harming anyone, nor yourself, is not inherently wrong. Interestingly, we see similar tropes in Western media. Romantic comedies, for instance, also idealize certain relationships, albeit less overtly. However, otome games go a step further by putting players in direct control of these romantic outcomes, making the experience even more immersive and more personal. Otome games have been an established genre for decades, offering immersive storytelling and romantic escapism primarily targeted toward women. These games provide a space where players can explore narratives built around affection, longing, and deep character-driven relationships. Their success obviously speaks for itself, proving that there is a market and demand for them. Previous titles like Mystic Messenger and Obey brought otome games to a broader audience, offering real-time interactions and even complex storylines that really blurred the line between game and reality. This growing popularity laid the foundation for Love in Deepspace, the foundation to push boundaries even further, not just in terms of storytelling and better fleshed out characters, but also in pushing the boundaries of the more sexual and intimate portions of the game, far beyond what games like Mystic Messenger and Obey Me dared to explore. However, there comes a time in most fandoms where people become hyper-attached and thereby hyper-defensive against any form of criticism toward their favorite media, like a game or a movie. While passion for something is understandable, and I share that passion as well for games like Silent Hill and Resident Evil, this level of overprotection can quickly turn obsessive. A phrase that comes to mind is to learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. While originally meant for political discourse, this sentiment can kind of be applied to fandom culture too, where any critique, no matter how fair or constructive, is met with some level of hostility. This obsessive defense can stifle meaningful conversations and prevent fans or people outside of the fandom from engaging with their favorite media in a critical but enjoyable way. With that context in mind, let's explore one of the more controversial discussions surrounding Love in Deepspace. The term Gooner game carries some negative connotations slinging around it, often dismissing a game as solely a vehicle for sexual gratification. But where is the issue here? The term gooning isn't exclusive to one gender. Women can be sexual creatures too. The idea that a game cannot be labeled a gooner game because of the shame attached to the word gooner is pretty silly in my opinion. Love in Deepspace being labeled as such isn't necessarily a bad thing, nor does it invalidate its artistic and emotional depth. From here, it's important to consider the broader context. Historically, men have dominated the gooner game trope with titles such as Nikkei Goddess of Victory and, from what I've heard from my friends, Zenless Zone Zero, which features hypersexualized female characters designed to cater to the male gaze. Furthermore, men have long engaged with explicit or highly suggestive content in gaming, anime, and cartoons without being shamed for it, whereas women who engage in the enjoyment of Love in Deepspace, whether for the more casual gooner or sexual aspects of the game, need to understand that they are equally valid in their enjoyment and should not be made to feel ashamed. I think some of the backlash against Love in Deepspace isn't just about fan service, it's about who gets to indulge in fantasy without judgment. For decades, men have engaged with hypersexualized gaming content without critique. The presence of a female-driven equivalent simply shifts that power dynamic, offering a space where women can indulge in their own tailored fantasies. In many ways, I think that this shift is refreshing. It evens the odds in a landscape where male-oriented fantasy has reigned supreme. However, it also brings challenges, such as toxic fan bases that may struggle to acknowledge that their game isn't meant for everyone. Some fans refuse to accept that Love in Deepspace isn't necessarily designed to appeal to men, and they should accept that. When male players critique the game, they are often met with hostility, even when they critique the game on a surface level. While it may seem like I'm praising the game in its perfection here, and see it as unblemished, this is far from the truth. While I feel the game is a breath of fresh air in a gooner game scene dominated by male-centric content, it suffers from the same issue that male-targeted gooner games do: unrealistic expectations and the romanticization of trauma. To circle back on the point I made earlier about men's insecurities, one reason I truly believe that men find Love in Deepspace to be cringe is the over-perfection of the characters. For the same reason women feel objectified, men tend to feel a sense of emasculation towards the character's unattainable perfection. Although this may seem like just plain insecurity, that isn't necessarily the case. For long periods of time, society has shown that the prime example of a man is somebody like Kratos from God of War or Doomguy from Doom. Both characters represent a very specific masculine ideal. They are quiet, strong, and emotionally unavailable. They're also unflinchingly capable. These figures reinforce the idea that strength and stoicism are the ultimate traits of masculinity, compared to the emotionally open and deeply vulnerable love interests in Love in Deepspace. The reality is, though, that men have largely built this cultural prison for themselves. And this is not about shifting the blame onto women, but rather helping everyone understand why it can be so difficult for men to adjust, especially when they've been taught that vulnerability is weakness and strength means emotional detachment. The emotionally open characters in Love in Deepspace can feel completely foreign to them. The stark contrast between these archetypes can feel alienating, creating a sense of insecurity or rejection when faced with a standard of emotional perfection that they have never really been encouraged to develop. One main gripe that I have with this game is the unattainable perfection of these characters, emphasized through their high-status professions, emotional depth, and grand romantic gestures. These portrayals may lead young or impressionable players to internalize unrealistic ideals about what a relationship should look like. Constant devotion, grand gestures, and flawless emotional availability may set an unattainable bar that can harm real-world expectations for partners. While idealization is part of the fantasy, it's important to separate fiction from reality. This concern becomes even more pressing when considering the game's low age rating. With a rating of 12+ on the App Store, Love in Deepspace is accessible to players as young as 13 or 14 years old. At such an impressionable age, it's easy for young players to absorb these depictions as aspirational and even normal, potentially shaping their expectations of what a relationship or partner should look like. Zane, for example, is portrayed as an aloof, cold, and professional cardiac surgeon, embodying a level of success and control that is nearly impossible to match. Raphael, on the other hand, is a kind and effortlessly talented artist, blending both extreme creativity and incredibly high emotional intelligence. Silas further adds to this idealized portrayal with his extravagant acts of care, most notably buying a couch for the protagonist just because she was on her period. Now, please don't get me wrong, I applaud the fact that women may potentially realize that they deserve more or deserve better. I think that that's overall a very good thing. Knowing your worth in a relationship is important and empowering. However, there's a fine line between understanding your worth and expecting perfection from your partner. While acts of kindness in relationships are always welcome, the kind of grand, flawless gestures depicted in Love in Deepspace can feel unrealistic, especially when viewed through a real-world lens. Compounded upon these gestures being presented as the norm rather than an occasional highlight or happening. Another concern that arises with the game's portrayal of perfection is its limited representation of diversity. There is nearly no representation of characters with darker skin tones or from varied cultural backgrounds. Additionally, all the male love interests are significantly taller than the average height for men in most, if not all, countries. Their skin is completely unblemished, and all of them is immaculately stylish at all times. Admittedly, this next point is one of the weaker points in my argument regarding unattainable perfection. However, when you're marketing to a game of highly impressionable 13 and 14 or 15-year-olds, it's not difficult to see how players could begin to internalize these depictions as the standard for what their future partners should look like. Perfect.
Listen closely.
In every way.
Do you want the same brand you usually use?
And nothing less. Unfortunately, this is not a phenomenon exclusive to female players only. Men, too, expect very similar levels of perfection from women, often influenced by depictions of women with flawless bodies, unreasonably large chests, and unattainable beauty standards perpetuated in media. This cycle feeds into mutual, unrealistic expectations that can really distort real-life relationships. This being said, beyond its romantic appeal, Love in Deepspace also offers engaging gameplay mechanics, stunning art, and a well-developed sci-fi world that deepens its immersive experience. It demonstrates how otome games can push beyond traditional storytelling and offer expansive narratives that rival mainstream gaming genres. And to wrap this all up, while I personally cannot say I would enjoy Love in Deepspace as a game for either its gooner game appeal or its more emotional touch, I think the game is still refreshing to have exist. As long as people and fandoms remain relatively normal about their passion for the game and open to reception and or constructive criticism, I for one think it holds a decently rightful place as a significant and valid entry into the otome game category. This, however, will not stop me from making fun of the game, especially with scenes like this.